Have you ever felt like the most spiritual thing you could do was to walk away from church? Have you ever sensed that following Jesus might actually require you to break some religious rules? If these thoughts have crossed your mind, you're not alone. And more importantly, you might be closer to authentic Christianity than you realize. There's a profound truth that A.W. Tozer understood deeply, one that challenges everything we think we know about what it means to be a good Christian. Sometimes the most Christ-like thing we can do is refuse to go along with the religious crowd. This isn't about rebellion for rebellion's sake, or rejecting all authority. This is about understanding that Jesus himself was considered a troublemaker by the religious establishment of his day. He broke their rules, challenged their systems, and refused to conform to their expectations. The Pharisees called him a rebel, a lawbreaker, someone who threatened the very foundations of their carefully constructed religious world. And they were right, in a way. Jesus was a rebel, but he was rebelling against the right things for the right reasons. What if I told you that your discomfort with certain aspects of modern Christianity might actually be the Holy Spirit stirring in your heart? What if that restlessness you feel during certain church services isn't a sign of spiritual immaturity, but rather a sign that you're beginning to hunger for something deeper, something more authentic? The Christianity that emerges in the quiet moments, away from the spotlight and the applause, is often the truest form of faith we can experience. This understanding can transform your entire approach to following Jesus. Instead of feeling guilty about questioning religious traditions, you might discover that asking hard questions is exactly what mature faith requires. Instead of forcing yourself to fit into religious molds that feel artificial, you might find the courage to pursue the kind of relationship with God that actually satisfies your soul. This isn't about creating chaos or disrespecting genuine spiritual authority. It's about learning to distinguish between what honors God and what merely honors religious systems. The journey we're about to take together will challenge some assumptions you might have about what it means to be a good Christian. We'll explore how Jesus himself modeled this kind of holy rebellion, and how you can learn to recognize when your spirit is being called to something deeper than mere compliance with religious expectations. If you're ready to discover what authentic Christianity really looks like, then you've come to the right place. A.W. Tozer lived through a time when American Christianity was becoming increasingly organized, systematized, and comfortable. He watched as churches grew larger, programs became more elaborate, and the faith that had once transformed lives began to feel more like a well-oiled social machine. Tozer saw something troubling in this development. He noticed that as Christianity became more acceptable to mainstream culture, it simultaneously became less transformative in individual lives. The very success of organized religion seemed to be diluting its spiritual power. Tozer understood what many of us are feeling today. He saw that when faith becomes too comfortable, too predictable, too focused on keeping everyone happy and engaged, it loses something essential. The radical edge that made Jesus so compelling to some and so threatening to others gets smoothed away in favor of a more palatable version of Christianity. But Tozer knew that this sanitized version, while it might fill pews and balance budgets, rarely produces the kind of deep, authentic relationship with God that the human soul craves. This is why Tozer wrote about Christianity being born after midnight. He wasn't talking about the time of day, but about the kind of faith that emerges when the crowds have gone home, when the programs have ended, when the spotlights are turned off. This is the Christianity that develops in the quiet places, in the secret chambers of the heart, in the moments when we're alone with God and stripped of all pretense. This faith doesn't need an audience, because it's not performing for anyone, but the one who sees in secret. But here's what makes this challenging for us today. We live in a time when religious activity is often mistaken for spiritual maturity. We measure our faith by how many church services we attend, how many Christian books we read, how many religious activities fill our calendars. We've created a culture where being busy for God is considered more valuable than being still with God. And in this environment, the person who questions whether all this activity is actually bringing them closer to God can feel like a spiritual failure. The truth is, your restlessness might be a gift. That sense that something is missing from your faith experience, that feeling that there should be more to Christianity than what you're currently experiencing, might be exactly what God is using to draw you into something deeper. Just as Jesus had to break free from the religious expectations of his day to fulfill his true calling, you might need to break free from certain religious expectations to discover what authentic faith actually looks like in your life. The problem isn't with wanting to please God or with respecting legitimate spiritual authority. The problem comes when we begin to mistake religious conformity for spiritual maturity. When we start to believe that fitting in with the Christian crowd is more important than being transformed by the living God, we've lost something essential. We've traded the adventure of following Jesus for the comfort of following a religious script. Jesus understood this tension perfectly. He lived it every day of his ministry. The religious leaders of his time had created an elaborate system of rules, traditions, and expectations that were supposed to help people connect with God. But Jesus could see that these systems had become barriers instead of bridges. They were keeping people from experiencing the very thing they claimed to provide. So Jesus did something that shocked everyone. He ignored the religious rules when they got in the way of love, healing, and genuine spiritual connection. Think about how this played out in Jesus' daily life. He healed people on the Sabbath, knowing full well that this would outrage the religious establishment. He didn't heal on the Sabbath to be rebellious or to show off his power. He healed because people were suffering, and love doesn't wait for the right day of the week to act. When confronted about this, Jesus didn't apologize or promise to be more careful about religious sensitivities. Instead, he challenged the entire premise that religious rules should take precedence over human need and divine compassion. Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, not because he was trying to be edgy or controversial, but because these were the people who were hungry for authentic spiritual connection. The religious folks already had their systems and their certainties. They weren't looking for transformation because they believed they had already arrived. But the outcasts, the broken, the desperate ones, they knew they needed something real. They weren't interested in playing religious games because their lives were too messy for games. This pattern continued throughout Jesus' ministry. He consistently chose people over protocols, relationship over rules, authentic spiritual connection over religious appearance. He did this so consistently that the religious leaders began to see him as a threat to everything they had built. And they were right. Jesus was threatening their system, not because he was against order or structure, but because he was against anything that prevented people from experiencing the living God. The most telling moment came when Jesus cleansed the temple. Here was the center of religious life, the place where people came to worship God, and Jesus found it full of merchants and money changers who had turned worship into a business transaction. His response wasn't to work within the system to gradually reform it. His response was to overturn the tables and drive out the merchants with a whip.
He was willing to create chaos in the religious system because the system was preventing people from encountering God. Now, imagine if someone did this in a modern church. Imagine if someone came into a service and started overturning the systems that seemed to be more about maintaining the institution than about helping people connect with God. That person would be labeled a troublemaker, a rebel, someone who doesn't understand how things work.
But Jesus shows us that sometimes disrupting religious systems is exactly what love requires. This is the heart of what Tozer meant when he talked about Christianity being born after midnight. The most authentic expressions of faith often happen away from the organized, systematic, programmed expressions of religion. They happen in the quiet moments when we're alone with God, when we're not trying to impress anyone or fit into any religious mold. They happen when we're desperate enough to seek God for who He really is, not for what He can do for our religious reputation. But here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't about rejecting all structure or authority. Jesus didn't reject the Hebrew Scriptures or the genuine spiritual principles they contained. He rejected the human additions that had been layered on top of those principles, the traditions that had become more important than the truth they were supposed to protect. He rejected the religious culture that had made serving God more about following rules than about loving people. In our context, this might mean recognizing that some of the things we've been taught are essential to Christianity might actually be obstacles to authentic faith. It might mean acknowledging that some of the religious activities we feel obligated to participate in might not be helping us grow spiritually. It might mean having the courage to say that some of the expectations placed on us by religious communities might not be what God actually wants from us. This is where the rubber meets the road in our daily lives. How do we live this out, practically? How do we know when we're being called to holy disobedience versus when we're just being selfish or rebellious? How do we distinguish between legitimate spiritual authority and religious manipulation? These are not easy questions, but they're necessary questions if we want to follow Jesus authentically. The first principle is to always measure religious expectations against the character of God as revealed in Jesus. If a religious rule or tradition makes it harder for people to experience God's love, grace, and transformation, then that rule or tradition needs to be questioned. This doesn't mean we become judges of everyone else's faith, but it does mean we take responsibility for our own spiritual journey and refuse to let religious systems substitute for genuine relationship with God. Consider how this might play out in your own life. Maybe you've been feeling pressured to participate in certain church activities that don't feel life-giving to you. Maybe you've been told that skipping these activities makes you a weak Christian, or that you're not committed enough. But what if God is actually calling you to spend that time in prayer, in serving others outside the church, or in simply being still and listening for His voice? What if the guilt you feel about not being more involved in church programs is actually misplaced? Or maybe you've been feeling convicted about certain practices in your faith community that seem to be more about maintaining appearances than about genuine spiritual growth. Maybe you've noticed that the emphasis on financial giving feels more like pressure than like worship. Maybe you've observed that the focus on numerical growth seems to be taking precedence over the spiritual health of the people who are already part of the community. These concerns don't make you a bad Christian. They might make you a more discerning one. The key is learning to trust the Holy Spirit's guidance in your own heart, while also remaining humble and open to correction. This isn't about becoming a Lone Ranger Christian who rejects all community and accountability. It's about learning to distinguish between the voice of God and the voice of religious culture. It's about developing the spiritual maturity to know when to submit and when to stand firm, when to go along and when to go against the flow. Think about the early Christians who had to make similar decisions. They lived in a culture where religious and political systems were deeply intertwined. They faced constant pressure to conform to religious expectations that would have compromised their faith. They had to learn when to obey human authority and when to obey God instead. When Peter and John were told to stop preaching about Jesus, they had to choose between religious compliance and spiritual obedience. Their response was simple but profound. We must obey God rather than men. This same principle applies to us today. When religious systems demand something from us that conflicts with what we sense God calling us to do, we have a choice to make. We can choose the safety of religious conformity, or we can choose the risk of spiritual authenticity. Neither choice is easy, but only one leads to the kind of faith that can transform us and the world around us. Sometimes this choice involves questioning long-held traditions. Maybe you've always been taught that certain spiritual practices are essential, but you've discovered that they don't help you connect with God. Maybe you've been told that you must serve in certain ways, but you feel called to serve differently. Maybe you've been pressured to give in certain ways, but you sense God leading you to be generous in different ways. These conflicts don't mean you're rebellious. They might mean you're growing. Other times, this choice involves standing against religious peer pressure. Maybe your faith community has certain expectations about how Christians should vote, how they should spend their money, how they should raise their children, or how they should engage with the broader culture. But what if God is calling you to approach these issues differently? What if the Holy Spirit is leading you to love people in ways that don't fit the religious mold? What if authentic Christianity in your life looks different from what it looks like in other people's lives? The courage to follow God's specific calling on your life, even when it doesn't match religious expectations, is one of the most Christ-like things you can do. Jesus didn't fit the religious mold of His day, and neither should we expect to fit perfectly into the religious molds of our day. This doesn't mean we become proud or judgmental toward others who are following God in different ways. It means we take responsibility for our own spiritual journey and refuse to let religious culture substitute for genuine spiritual growth. Learning to live this way requires developing what Tozer called the knowledge of the holy. This means learning to recognize God's voice, His character, His heart, His ways. It means spending enough time in quiet communion with Him that we can distinguish between His leading and the various other voices that compete for our attention. It means developing the kind of spiritual sensitivity that can discern when religious activity is helping us grow and when it's simply keeping us busy. This knowledge doesn't come from reading books about God, though good books can help. It doesn't come from attending more church services, though corporate worship can be valuable. It comes from the kind of personal, intimate relationship with God that can only be developed through consistent, honest, vulnerable communion with Him. It comes from the Christianity that is born after midnight, in the quiet places where we meet God without an audience. As you begin to develop this kind of relationship with God, you'll find that you become less concerned with what other people think about your faith and more concerned with what God thinks. You'll find that you're less motivated by religious obligations and more motivated by love. You'll discover that you're less interested in fitting into religious categories and more interested in being transformed into the image of Jesus. This transformation is what authentic Christianity is all about. It's not about being a better religious person or a more faithful church member, though those things might happen along the way. It's about becoming the person God created you to be, the person who can love like Jesus loved, serve like Jesus served, and challenge systems like Jesus challenged them when those systems get in the way of what God is trying to do in the world. So how do you start living this way? How do you begin to distinguish between helpful religious structure and restrictive religious control? How do you develop the courage to follow God's specific leading in your life, even when it doesn't match what everyone else is doing? The first step is to commit to spending regular time alone with God, away from all the religious activity and programming. This doesn't mean you have to become a hermit or abandon all Christian community. It means you need to create space in your life for the kind of quiet, intimate communion with God that can't happen in a crowd. This is where you'll learn to hear His voice clearly and distinguish it from all the other voices that compete for your attention. Start with just 15 minutes a day of sitting quietly in God's presence. Don't bring an agenda or a list of things you want to say. Just come to be with Him, to listen, to open your heart to whatever He might want to communicate to you. This might feel awkward at first, especially if you're used to more structured forms of prayer or Bible study. But this kind of unstructured time with God is where the deepest spiritual growth often happens. As you develop this habit, you'll begin to notice that God's voice has a different quality than the voices of religious expectation or social pressure. God's voice leads you toward love, toward freedom, toward authentic relationship with Him and with others. Religious voices often lead you toward performance, toward conformity, toward activities that make you look good to other people, but don't necessarily help you grow spiritually. The second step is to begin evaluating your current religious activities and commitments honestly. Ask yourself whether each activity is helping you grow spiritually, or whether it's just keeping you busy. Ask whether each commitment is flowing from your love for God, or from your fear of disappointing other people. Ask whether each involvement is leading you toward authentic relationship with God, or toward religious performance. This evaluation isn't about suddenly dropping all your commitments or abandoning your faith community. It's about becoming more intentional about how you spend your spiritual energy. It's about making sure that your religious activities are actually serving your spiritual growth rather than substituting for it. You might discover that some activities that you thought were essential to your faith are actually draining your spiritual energy without giving much back. You might find that some commitments you made out of guilt or social pressure aren't actually flowing from your heart's desire to serve God. You might realize that some religious expectations you've been trying to meet aren't actually helping you become more like Jesus. The third step is to develop the courage to make changes based on what you discover. This is often the hardest part because it might mean disappointing people who have certain expectations of you. It might mean having uncomfortable conversations with religious leaders or friends who don't understand why you're questioning things that seem obvious to them. It might mean facing criticism from people who interpret your spiritual growth as spiritual rebellion. But remember that Jesus faced the same kind of criticism. The religious people of His day were constantly questioning His spiritual credentials because He didn't fit their mold. They couldn't understand how someone who was truly spiritual could be so casual about their religious traditions. They couldn't see that His apparent disregard for their systems was actually flowing from His deep love for God and for people. As you begin to live more authentically, you might face similar misunderstanding. Some people might interpret your spiritual maturity as spiritual pride. Some might see your freedom as rebellion. Some might think you're becoming less committed to your faith when you're actually becoming more committed to God. This is the cost of authentic Christianity, but it's also the path to the kind of faith that can truly transform your life. The fourth step is to find or create community with others who are on a similar journey. This doesn't mean you have to leave your current faith community, but it does mean you need to connect with people who understand that spiritual growth sometimes requires questioning religious assumptions. You need relationships with people who can encourage you when you're facing criticism for following God's specific calling on your life. This kind of community might be harder to find than the kind that's organized around shared religious activities, but it's deeper and more authentic. It's the kind of community that forms around shared spiritual hunger rather than shared religious preferences. It's the kind of community that can celebrate your spiritual growth even when it doesn't look like what everyone else is doing. Finally, remember that this journey is not about becoming a perfect Christian or achieving some higher spiritual status. It's about becoming a real Christian, someone whose faith is authentic, honest, and growing. It's about learning to love God and people the way Jesus did, even when that love doesn't fit into neat religious categories. The goal is not to become a religious rebel who rejects all authority and structure. The goal is to become a mature believer who can distinguish between helpful structure and harmful control, between legitimate spiritual authority and religious manipulation, between activities that promote spiritual growth and activities that substitute for it. As you continue on this journey, you'll find that authentic Christianity is both simpler and more challenging than the religious version. It's simpler because it's focused on love, on relationship, on becoming the person God created you to be. It's more challenging because it requires you to take responsibility for your own spiritual growth and to make decisions based on your direct relationship with God rather than on religious expectations. You'll discover that the Christianity born after midnight, in the quiet places where you meet God without an audience, is more satisfying than any religious activity you've ever participated in. You'll find that the freedom to follow God's specific calling on your life, even when it doesn't match what everyone else is doing, is more fulfilling than any religious approval you've ever received. This is the hidden truth that Jesus lived and that Tozer understood. Sometimes the most Christian thing you can do is refuse to go along with the religious crowd. Sometimes disobedience to religious systems is actually obedience to God. Sometimes the faith that looks least religious is actually the most spiritual. The question is whether you're ready to pursue this kind of authentic relationship with God, even if it means questioning some religious assumptions you've never questioned before. Are you ready to discover what Christianity looks like when it's not performing for an audience? Are you ready to find out what it means to follow Jesus, even when that following doesn't fit into the religious molds that others might expect you to fill? If you are, then you're ready for the adventure of authentic Christianity. You're ready to discover the faith that is born after midnight, in the quiet places where God meets with those who are hungry enough to seek Him for who He really is, not for what He can do for their religious reputation. You're ready to experience the kind of relationship with God that transforms not just your spiritual life, but your entire approach to living in this world. This is the Christianity that Jesus modeled, that the early believers lived, and that countless faithful followers of God throughout history have discovered. It's available to you right now, not as something you have to earn or achieve, but as something you can step into by simply being honest about your spiritual hunger and courageous enough to follow wherever God leads you, even if that leading takes you away from the religious crowd and into the authentic, transformative relationship with God that your soul has been craving all along.